There is a massive epidemic in the modern format right now, and it kind of relates to the worst type of modern player out there. And that's what I want to talk about today. It's not the Tron players, it's not the Amulet players. It actually is, again, the Grief players, but in a different way. It's not exactly Rakdos Scam that I want to talk about today. It's going to be Mono Black Scam, or 8-Rack, or whatever you want to call it. And it's not really 8-Rack at this point. It's kind of evolved because, unfortunately, the cards have gotten better. And really, I want to talk about this from the aspect of the current climate of the modern metagame and where it's evolved, and honestly just how degenerate it's become. If a deck like this can succeed to such a high degree, do we really need to foster this type of environment ahead of the next big rotation of the modern format, coming very soon, by the way, to a metagame near you in June with Modern Horizons 3, bringing about a whole new suite of free spells. And I think it's very important to discuss some of the play patterns of these spells and how a deck like this can actually be further exacerbated, and how ultimately I think there needs to be a change that maybe I was wrong about, many other content creators as well. Now, 8-Rack itself, Mono Black Scam, it's centered around two very broken cards, or Grief and Orcish Bowmasters. Very simple. Now, Grief we've seen for a while in the modern metagame, and it's very obvious that this card is absolutely insane. With the Grief Not Dead After All lines, where you cast Grief for free by pitching a black card in your hand, then you reanimate it with the Not Dead After All, that whole sequence ultimately ends up in your opponent losing the two best cards in their hand. That's just as simple as that. Now, they could also lose their removal spells, their turn 1 play, turn 2 play, whatever it might be. You're then left as the scam player with a 4/3 on board with Menace. So essentially, it's a 3 for 3. You use up 3 spells, you play 1, you exile 1, and you cast 1 to force your opponent to have 3, because then your opponent has to have a removal spell for it. They then lose 2 cards, but the value they get out of it, the scam player gets out of this whole sequence, feels like way worse than a 3 for 3. It feels like a million for 3 in favor of the scam player, just because of the value they get, the tempo that they gain from this interaction. And that is the type of thing that this Mono Black Scam decks wants to abuse, because it ultimately says that when I mid-range you out of the game, when I thoughtseize you out of the game, if you want to draw out of it, I can cast Orcish Bowmasters and punish you heavily for it. I can make bodies off of it. And if you have some really explosive plays, then I want to play those cards as well, thanks to a card like Douthie Voidwalker. And ultimately, if you want to steal your opponent's Ulamogs and everything, that has happened on camera, and that, link down below with the whole Pro Tour Lord of the Rings thing. But Douthie Voidwalker is an absolutely insane card, functionally having unblockable with the whole shadow thing going on. But then you also have some amount of copies of Shieldred as well for the late game, or if your opponent continues to top deck and you don't have many threats either, Shieldred will create that life differential. But when it comes to the whole rack side of things, it really comes down to the rack, the namesake card of the original 8-Rack deck. A 1-mana artifact that says, when it comes into play, choose an opponent. So not very EDH friendly, I should add. At the beginning of that player's chosen upkeep, the rack deals X damage to that player, where X is 3 minus the number of cards in their hand. Now, what this essentially means is 3 minus the number of cards in your hand. If opponent has 7 cards in their hand, it deals 3 minus 7. It's 0. You're not dealing negative damage here. But then if your opponent has 0 cards in their hand, it is 3 minus 0. The rack is dealing 3 damage. So the whole point of this deck is to try and get you empty-handed. And this is kind of where the modern metagame has shifted, to the idea that decks are getting more empty-handed. And I think Modern Horizons 3 is going to exacerbate this problem even more. And I think this is a function of the times of the design of free spells. And whether or not this is good, we're going to kind of get into here. So what am I talking about? When decks want to get empty-handed, they generally are doing broken things. They are generally playing the Modern Horizons 2 elementals, for example, like Grief, where they're losing a card out of their hand to play another card for free. They're putting themselves down on 2 resources essentially just to get the value of 1. They're playing that card out and they're losing another card. So generally speaking, hands have less cards in their hand. Just players have less cards in their hand, right? And honestly, with the mulligan rules that changed, way long ago at this point, I feel like over time, especially with combo decks and more value-centric decks being available in the format, those decks in general are more likely to mulligan. So I feel like just higher than normal than, you know, maybe a decade ago. Generally speaking, modern players have less cards in their hand because they're more likely to mulligan to find the high value cards, to find the combo pieces. And so really you see the rise of these extremely explosive plays or decks that are very, you know, kind of against thoughtseize. They can beat thoughtseize, and that's exacerbated by the Cascade decks. Cascade decks are an example of a deck that just wants to play land, then cast a Cascade spell. So it really doesn't care if the Cascade spell is in hand. They could top deck it. And that's kind of beating that Rakdos Scam mentality. When Rakdos Scam was all over the metagame before Fury was banned, I kind of want to talk about that ban in a second, by the way. When it was banned, the metagame really needed to work around not having cards in your hand. Were you faster or were you better than the Rakdos Scam deck? Could you survive losing your 2 best cards? Could you top deck your way out of a win? Or could you stop what your opponent's doing in terms of the value that they're getting? Is your turn 1 play, is your top deck better than the Scam player? And that's essentially what it said. If you attack my hand, if I go first, does the play I make just ultimately end up being better than yours? And that could be seen in cards like Ragavan. So you play out a Ragavan and then your opponent goes to thoughtseize your hand. Well, then maybe you have like an Unholy Heat to remove that card, or you lose some cards and ultimately you're able to fill up your graveyard and ultimately play a Murktide. So explosive plays. Or you play the Cascade decks that then, as I was mentioning, top deck their way through. They could just go land, be empty-handed, top deck something like an Ardent Plea, and then cascade into a Living End or Crashing Footfalls, as we see right now in the current modern metagame. And that's really the exemplification of what this is. The modern metagame has shifted in such a way to fight discard, to fight grief, to ultimately work around a whole discard mechanic that is exemplified by the worst modern player out there, the thoughtseize player. And this is a very subjective opinion. I get it. If you've been watching this channel for a very long time, you'll know as a mill player, I hate thoughtseize. I don't like thoughtseize. I understand why it needs to be in the format, and I'm not calling for a ban of the card. I just hate the play pattern. If you're gonna thoughtseize me out of the game, I roll my eyes and I cringe. But every player has their vice. You're allowed to hate Tron, you're allowed to hate Amulet, you're allowed to hate Combo. I hate thoughtseize. And grief is the exemplification of that. It just really, it becomes a threat after they take use of it, and they're able to just take away the cards that I want to play. I think I would rather have my spells countered for the rest of eternity than have them taken away from my hand. I'd rather play around the counter spell and have the ability to cast my spell than have that play pattern of constantly having it be countered. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Would you rather have your spells countered after you cast them, or would you rather just not have them at all? I think the average casual player would just say that they would rather just want to cast their spells, but maybe that's just me. But that type of play pattern I don't think is great, and the mono black Scam deck has really been making a big comeback. I took big notice of it on kind of at the end of April, where it actually placed 3rd in a modern challenge, and I'll link that deck list down below as well. And since then, it's been appearing periodically throughout the modern challenges, and not necessarily in top 8 or top 16, sometimes in a top 32, but really what's going on with this is that if a deck like this is able to succeed with all this value, with the Murktide decks, with the Rakdos Scam decks, with the Cascade decks, with all these decks that are either clones of this deck or able to fight this deck, how is something like this able to succeed? What is it taking advantage of? And I think really what it is a symptom of the free spells that exist in the format right now. And what will happen in Modern Horizons 3 with the design of cards that are free but have a mana cost. Think of the free counterspell that's coming out with Modern Horizons 3. How it has the mana cost of cancel, blue, and 1, but then you can cast it for free while pitching a card off of the field. Now, this is a bit of a change design. We had cards like Force of Will being the quintessential pitch spell, probably the most recognizable pitch spell out there. For those more sadistic players, it might be Commandeer, but really it's going to be Force of Will. And then after that, it was Force Negation. And then after that, it was the Modern Horizons 2 Elemental cycle. Those became the most recognizable exile a card from your hand, play a card for free type of spell. And free spells have really come a long way. They're no longer Phyrexian spells like Gut Shot, or they're no longer Pact of Negations, right? Where they're just 0 and have a downside after. Because the 0 and have a downside after, yeah, they tend to be pretty good, right? The downside, it doesn't really matter because you tend to use them in a spot where you can win immediately. So you need to have an upfront cost, and that's what they did with the pitch spells. And I feel like with that, with losing cards from your hand, with this era that we've had of pitch spells, where Modern is dominated by having lower cards in your hand, but higher value per card being played, I think that's where decks like Scam are allowed to shine, and I'm not a fan of it. I don't think this is where Modern should be going. I think things should have a mana cost. I'm not necessarily advocating for things to go back to costing less, but I think that these cards having so much value per card is absolutely insane. It's like if you lose one, you can just play the other and get a very equivalent amount of value. If they, stop you from playing the Grief, then they can just play the Douthly Voidwalker, they can play the Orcish Bowmasters. You ultimately have all of these kind of linchpin cards that really just force your opponent to play around everything. Right? They have so many options on each single turn that could get you to discard a card, destroy your card, make something unblockable, just swing at you for a bunch. And then ultimately with something like Mono Black Scam outvalue you with something like the Rack and Liliana the Veil. Heck, if Liliana the Veil can get 3rd place in 2024 Modern, is that a good or bad thing? Because of the way it's being registered. It's not Jund, it's not a fair deck. It's a scam deck. It's trying to stop everything you're trying to do in a fair way. And with Modern Horizons 3, we do see a shift in the free spell cycle, but I think with certain cards like Urza's Factory, Urza's Workshop, I should say, Ugin's Workshop, I just stumbled my way through that whole card. Ugin's Workshop, essentially having you imprint a card. I can imagine there potentially being more imprint cards in this set. They might be weaker, they might be stronger, but randomly just putting imprint on just a random spoiler, I think there's going to be more imprint cards. And so I think we're just going to see even less cards in players' hands. And I think what this is doing is leaning the Modern metagame into a world where Scam is just going to be better and better and better. And again, I don't think that's what we want. I think we need to be careful about the card design that we have, and at this point we can't stop Modern Horizons 3. There's nothing we can do about it. Scam has taken over the Modern metagame, and Modern Horizons 3 likely, in my prediction, will print more imprint cards. We will have the free pitch spell cycles, we will have the imprint cards, we will have less cards in hand on average, and then that'll lead to Rakdos Scam, to Grief line just being better. This is where I ultimately lead up to where I think we were wrong. I think Grief at this point should have been the ban. I get that Fury, I think, was a positive aspect, like a positive change for the format. I think so, but I think Grief should have gone. I think I was a lot more okay with Grief, but maybe not with the direction that Modern Horizons 3 is going. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I've kind of yapped on for a little bit. Let me know what you think of makings of the start of the new setup in the background. I might change some things. Rate the fight sticks, by the way, in the back. Some of you longtime viewers have seen these fight sticks before. Rate the fight sticks. Let me know what you think. I got a little Rock Lee, I got a little custom one. Let's play some Street Fighter 6 together, but that's after we figure out whether or not Mono Black Scam really is taking over the metagame and whether or not it is ultimately healthy for the state of Modern and the direction that things are going. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I just want to kind of blab about this in general as a Modern player. I don't know if I like where things are going.